The war between the tribes had raged for generations until one brutal accident forced 5 sworn enemies to open their eyes. When the dust settled, 5 rivals found themselves broken, stranded, and alive only because of each other. What began as a desperate fight for survival would become the last chance the frontier ever had for peace. The frontier sprawled endless beneath a sky the color of old bruises. Spring had come reluctantly to the territories that year, dragging winter's cold breath behind it like a wounded animal refusing to die. In the highlands where the pine forests surrendered to stone, 5 paths converged without knowledge of one another, drawn by fate or chance or something darker still. Tahon'teh rode alone, as he had for 3 seasons now. The Cheyenne warrior carried his grief like a second skin, worn so long it had become part of him. His face was a landscape of hard angles and deeper shadows, marked by a scar that ran from temple to jaw, a gift from an Apache blade 2 winters past. That blade had taken more than flesh. It had taken his brother, his closest friend, and left Tahon'teh with a heart that beat only for revenge. He traveled the high country, now on behalf of his people, scouting trade routes through the mountains, but every stone and tree whispered memories of blood. His horse, a battle-scarred gray mare, picked her way carefully along the narrow trail that wound through the canyon walls. Above, clouds gathered like conspirators. To the south, Nayeli moved through the scrub brush with the practiced silence of her people. At 17 winters she was young to be traveling alone, but the Apache did not coddle their daughters, and necessity had carved her into something harder than her years suggested. She carried medicine herbs for her grandmother, who lay fevered and dying in their camp 3 days' ride away. The journey required passing through lands her people had sworn never to enter, lands stained with Apache blood, spilled by crow arrows and Lakota lances. But love demanded courage, and so she climbed higher into the mountains where the air grew thin and her breath came in visible clouds. Her dark eyes scanned the trail ahead, missing nothing, trusting nothing. She had painted her face with white clay before entering these territories, marking herself as one on a sacred mission. Whether her enemies would honor such markings, she did not know. From the western approach came Wicasa, older than the others by 15 winters, his braided hair shot through with silver. The Lakota holy man had dreamed of this journey for 3 moons, visions that came in the hour before dawn, when the spirit world pressed closest to the waking one. In his dreams he saw fire and stone, blood and water, 5 colors twisting into one. He saw faces he did not recognize, heard languages he could not speak, and felt a grief so vast it seemed to swallow the very stars. The visions had driven him from his people's encampment with nothing but his medicine bundle, his staff, and a conviction that something waited for him in these mountains, something that would reshape the world or end it. He prayed as he walked, singing the old songs under his breath, asking the spirits for guidance even as his old knees protested the steep terrain. The wind carried voices to him, but he could not make out their words. Ayasha tracked the wolf alone, as she had tracked it for 6 days now. The crow warrior had followed the beast from her people's territory, where it had killed 2 children and mauled a woman gathering firewood. She was the best tracker her tribe had, the daughter of a great hunter, though that father was 3 winters dead, killed in a raid against the Cheyenne. The wolf's prince led her higher and higher into hostile country, and she knew the danger of her position. But the wolf had to die, and Ayasha had never left the hunt unfinished. Her rifle was loaded, her knife sharp, her heart cold as the mountain streams. She had learned long ago to bury her fear beneath purpose, to transform grief into motion. The wolf's tracks disappeared into a narrow defile between towering cliffs, and she followed without hesitation, though the sky above was darkening, and the wind had begun to taste of storm. Pauki had been traveling for 12 days, longer than he had ever been from his Hopi mesas. The journey terrified him, but duty was a chain that could not be broken. He carried messages between his people and a distant trading post, words of alliance and commerce carefully memorized, because he could not risk them being captured in writing. At 23 winters he was considered a man, but he had never felt like one. He had not taken a wife, had not distinguished himself in any craft or skill, had not earned the respect that came easily to his brothers. He walked the high trail because someone had to, and no one else had volunteered. Every shadow made him start. Every bird cry sounded like a war whoop. The knife at his belt had never drawn blood, and he prayed to all the spirits that it never would. The mountains loomed around him like the walls of a trap, and though the day was not yet old, he longed for its ending. None of them knew the others were there. None of them could have imagined what was about to bring them together. The trail narrowed as it entered the canyon proper, a slash of shadow between walls of rust-colored stone that rose 200 feet on either side. It was a place called Dead Man's Throat by trappers and settlers, though the tribes had older names for it, names that spoke of spirits and blood and ancient betrayals. The path through it was barely wide enough for a horse, winding along a shelf of stone above a dry ravine filled with tumbled boulders and the bleached bones of animals that had made fatal mistakes. The walls leaned inward, shutting out much of the sky, creating a permanent twilight even at midday. Tahon'teh entered first, his mare's hooves ringing against stone. He noted the freshness of the tracks ahead on shod horses, a woman by her stride, moving fast. Apache, his instincts told him, and his hand moved to the rifle across his saddle. But he was here for scouting, not vengeance, and he rode on. The wind funneled through the canyon with a low moan, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something sharp and wrong that he could not name. Nayeli was 100 yards behind him, walking now, her breathing labored in the thin air. She had seen the Cheyenne's tracks and slowed her pace, considering whether to turn back or press forward. To retreat was to sentence her grandmother to death. To continue was to risk meeting an enemy alone in a place where no one would hear her scream. She chose forward, as she had always chosen, her hand tight on the knife at her belt. Wicasa descended from the northern approach, his staff tapping rhythmically against stone. The visions had intensified as he climbed, coming now even in waking hours, flashes of faces, glimpses of fire, the taste of ash in his mouth. He sang louder to drown out his fear, the old healing songs, the prayers for safe passage. His voice echoed strangely in the narrow space, as if the canyon itself were singing back. Ayasha crouched at the canyon's western entrance, studying the ground. The wolf's prints continued into the defile, but they were joined now by other tracks, human tracks, multiple sets, converging from different directions. Her warrior's mind calculated the danger. Whatever waited ahead, it was more than just a wolf hunt now, but she had come too far to turn back. She checked her rifle one more time and entered the throat of stone. Pauki approached from the east, stumbling in his weariness, his feet blistered and bleeding inside his worn moccasins. He had been climbing since before dawn, desperate to reach the trading post before his supplies ran out. The canyon trail was the shortest route, though it was also the most dangerous. He had nearly talked himself into taking the longer path around, but daylight was burning, and his courage, what little he possessed, had rallied one more time. He entered the shadows between the cliffs with his heart hammering and his mouth dry. The explosion came without warning. High on the southern wall, where the stone had been carefully weakened over days of secret labor, the charges detonated in a rolling thunder that seemed to split the mountain itself. For an eternal moment, nothing seemed to happen. The world hung suspended in shock. Then the cliff face began to move. Thousands of tons of stone broke free, an avalanche of rock and dust that roared down into the canyon with the voice of an angry god. The concussion hit first, a wall of pressure that slammed into bodies and hurled them like leaves. Then came the debris boulders the size of buffalo, shards of stone like spear points, a choking cloud of dust that turned day into night. Tahon'teh's mare screamed and reared, throwing him from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs, and then he was rolling, scrambling, crawling desperately as the world came apart around him. A boulder crashed down inches from his head. Another shattered against the path where he had been standing a moment before. He found a slight overhang in the wall and pressed himself into it, making himself as small as possible as the mountain fell and fell. Nayeli was running before the first stone hit the ground. Some instinct, the same that had kept her alive through 17 winters in hostile country, sent her sprinting forward, into the heart of the canyon rather than back the way she had come. She felt the stones strike the path behind her, felt the trail disintegrate beneath her feet, and then she was diving, hurling herself into a narrow cleft in the wall that she had noticed only in passing. She wedged herself deep into the crack as the avalanche roared past, blocking out light and air and hope. Wicasa heard the spirit scream a warning, or perhaps it was only the sound of splitting stone, and threw himself flat against the canyon floor. Boulders bounced overhead, some so close he felt the wind of their passing. One struck his leg a glancing blow, and he felt something crack, a bright explosion of pain that made his vision white out. But he stayed conscious, stayed still, and prayed with every breath as death danced around him. Ayasha saw the rock face coming down and did the only thing that might save her. She ran deeper into the canyon, racing the avalanche, her powerful legs driving her forward with desperate speed. She knew she could not outrun it, knew that death was seconds behind her, but she ran anyway because that was what warriors did. A falling stone caught her shoulder and spun her round, and she fell hard, sliding and tumbling until she fetched up against a standing boulder that somehow stayed standing. She curled herself behind it as the world ended, feeling the impacts shudder through stone into her body, each one like a hammer blow to her soul. Pauki froze, and that froze saved him. He was still near the canyon's entrance when the avalanche hit, and the bulk of the debris fell farther in. But the shock wave knocked him down, and smaller stones rained around him, and when a rock the size of a man's head bounced toward him, he could only watch it come, too terrified to move. It struck his arm, and he heard the snap of bone even through his own screaming. He rolled away, found himself against the canyon wall, and pressed there as the rain of stone continued. And then, after an eternity that lasted perhaps 30 seconds, it was over. The silence that followed was more terrible than the thunder had been. Dust hung in the air so thick it was like fog, turning every breath into a choking rasp. The canyon was transformed. What had been a narrow path was now choked with rubble, the walls scarred and raw where the cliff face had torn away. In 5 different places, 5 people lay in the aftermath, injured, shocked, and utterly alone. Except they were not alone. Tahon'teh was the first to move, dragging himself out from his shelter with the caution of a man who expects the mountain to resume its attack at any moment. His ribs screamed with every breath, cracked, if not broken, and blood ran from a gash across his forehead, filling his left eye with red. But he was alive, and survival demanded he stay that way. He stood slowly, swaying, and surveyed the devastation. The path forward was blocked entirely, a wall of rubble reaching nearly to the canyon's rim. Behind him, the way back was similarly impassable. He was trapped in a section of canyon perhaps 70 yards long, walls too sheer to climb, no way forward or back. And worse, he heard sounds. Not the settling of stone, but something else. Movement, breathing, human sounds. His rifle was gone, buried somewhere in the chaos. He drew his knife and turned slowly, scanning the dust-choked shadows. His warrior's instincts screamed danger. Someone else was alive in this trap with him. An enemy, his mind insisted. Always an enemy. A shape emerged from the dust ahead, small, moving slowly. Tahon'teh tensed, raising his blade. The figure stumbled, caught itself against the canyon wall, and he saw it clearly for the first time. A young woman, Apache by the cut of her clothing and the beadwork pattern on her buckskin shirt. Her face was painted white, the mark of a sacred journey, though the dust and blood had obscured much of it. She carried no visible weapons, and her eyes were dazed, unfocused. Nayeli blinked dust from her eyes and found herself staring at a Cheyenne warrior with murder on his face and a knife in his hand. Terror spiked through her, cutting through the shock of the avalanche. She had no knife, it had been lost when she dove into the crevice. She had nothing but her bare hands and a body that felt like it had been beaten with war clubs. She took a step back, raising her hands, not in surrender, but in readiness to fight if fighting was all that remained to her. They stared at one another across 15 feet of rubble, two people who should have been trying to kill each other, both too hurt and too shocked to do anything but breathe. The sound of falling stones made them both turn. From the northern section of the trapped canyon, another figure was pulling itself upright. An old man, Lakota by the style of his braids and the medicine bundle that still somehow hung from his belt. He leaned heavily on a gnarled staff, his left leg twisted at an angle that suggested a break. His face was seamed with pain, but his eyes were clear, and when he looked at Tahon'teh and Nayeli, there was no hatred in them, only a deep, weary sadness. Wicasa saw what the others could not yet perceive. The vision was upon him fully now, searing through his mind with a clarity that was almost painful. These two were part of it, part of what he had been sent to find. There would be more. The spirits had shown him 5, and so there would be 5. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell them what he knew, but before he could form the words, another presence announced itself. Ayasha rose from behind her boulder like a ghost solidifying from smoke. Blood matted her hair and ran down her face, and her left shoulder hung at an odd angle dislocated, though she had not yet registered the injury through the greater shock of survival. Her rifle was still somehow in her right hand, and when she saw the others, Cheyenne, Apache, Lakota, her training took over. She swung the rifle up, working the lever one-handed despite the pain, centering the barrel on the Cheyenne warrior because he was the closest threat. Tahon'teh spun at the motion, knife still ready, and found himself facing a Crow warrior with a gun. The world seemed to slow. He could dive for cover, but there was no cover adequate to stop a bullet. He could charge, but she would shoot him before he closed half the distance. He could throw his knife, but even if it struck true, her dying reflex might still pull the trigger. He stood frozen in the mathematics of death, unable to see a path that did not end with him bleeding out on the stones. Nayeli saw the Crow warrior's finger tighten on the trigger and knew the Cheyenne would die. Some part of her whispered that this was good, that the death of an enemy was always good. But a louder part she had not known existed rejected the thought with a violence that surprised her. She moved without thinking, without planning, throwing herself forward even as the rifle fired. The bullet meant for Tahon'teh's chest struck Nayeli in the side, punching through skin and muscle and exiting out her back in a spray of red. She fell hard, gasping, her hands pressed to the wound even as blood welled between her fingers. The shock of it seemed to ripple through the canyon, breaking whatever spell had held the others frozen. Ayasha stared at the Apache girl she had just shot, the girl who had saved her enemy's life, and felt her mind rebel against understanding. The rifle slipped from her fingers, clattering on the stones. She took a step forward, then another, moving toward the fallen girl as if drawn by something beyond her will. Her own pain had become distant, irrelevant. Tahon'teh dropped his knife. He did not decide to do so. His hand simply opened, and the weapon fell. He moved to Nayeli's side, kneeling beside her, pressing his hands over hers against the wound. Her blood was hot, pulsing between his fingers in a rhythm that spoke of a heart still fighting. He had seen enough battle wounds to know she would die without help. He looked up at the others, at the old Lakota and the Crow warrior, and saw in their faces the same horrified realization that was dawning in his own mind. They were trapped together, injured, with no way out. And if any of them died, it would not be from ancient hatred, it would be from the wounds they had just inflicted on one another. A sound from the eastern section of the canyon pulled their attention. Pauki emerged from the dust, cradling his broken arm against his chest, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his young face. He saw the others and stopped, terror washing over him so completely that his knees went weak. Cheyenne, Apache, Lakota, Crow, every nation that had ever taught him to fear was represented here. And the Apache girl was bleeding, dying, and they were all staring at him with expressions he could not read. Wicasa spoke then, his voice cutting through the shocked silence with the authority of a holy man who had seen beyond the veil of the present moment into the shape of what must come. He spoke in Lakota, knowing they might not understand, but speaking anyway because the words had to be said. The Cheyenne warrior looked at him, uncomprehending. Wicasa tried again, this time in the trader's tongue, the broken mix of languages that allowed the tribes to communicate when they met for commerce rather than war. His words were simple, blunt, impossible to misinterpret. We help her, or we all die here, together. Saving Nayeli became their unwitting treaty, the first fragile thread connecting them across generations of bloodshed. Tahon'teh, despite every instinct screaming that this Apache girl was his enemy, found himself tearing strips from his own shirt to pack the wound. His hands were steady, the same hands that had killed Apache warriors, now working to save an Apache life. The irony was not lost on him, but there was no room for such thoughts. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing vital organs by what seemed like the mercy of fate or spirits. But she was losing blood fast, her face growing pale, her breathing shallow. Wicasa dragged himself closer, his broken leg a white-hot agony he pushed to the back of his mind through decades of discipline and prayer. He opened his medicine bundle with shaking hands, pulling out what he needed: herbs to slow bleeding, powders to prevent wound fever, sacred objects to call upon healing spirits. He worked over the girl while speaking in a low, rhythmic chant, the old words flowing like water, creating a space of peace in the midst of chaos. Ayasha watched, standing apart, her dislocated shoulder sending waves of nausea through her with every heartbeat. She had shot this girl, had aimed to kill the Cheyenne, and instead brought down someone who had tried to save him. The weight of it was crushing, incomprehensible. She was a warrior, had killed before in raids and defense, but those deaths had fit into the order of things, enemy killing enemy, the way the world worked. This was different. This was wrong in a way she had no words for. Pauki stood at the edge of the group, unable to help, his broken arm useless and the pain making him lightheaded. He had no skills to offer, no medicine knowledge, no warrior's training. He could only watch and shake and wonder if the spirits had brought him here to die in the company of enemies. It took the better part of an hour to stabilize Nayeli. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. Her breathing steadied, though she remained unconscious, her body's defense against the trauma. Wicasa sat back finally, exhausted, and looked up at the others. His eyes found Ayasha, standing there with her shoulder hanging wrong, trying to remain stoic through obvious agony. He spoke to her in the trader's tongue, gesturing to her injury. She shook her head, refusing at first, but he spoke again, more insistent. Tahon'teh, understanding what needed to happen, moved toward her. She flinched back, and he stopped, raising his hands to show they were empty. He spoke then, slowly, in the broken trade language that most warriors learned for dealing with other tribes during those brief periods when killing paused for commerce. The shoulder needs to be set. I have done it before. It will hurt, but you will use the arm again. Ayasha looked at him, this Cheyenne warrior, this enemy, and saw only exhaustion and pain that matched her own. She thought of the girl bleeding on the ground, the girl who had saved this man's life for no reason that made sense. Slowly, she nodded. Tahon'teh moved closer, explaining what he would do, where she should sit, how she should breathe. Ayasha lowered herself to the ground, bracing against a stone, and he knelt beside her. Pauki turned away, unable to watch. Wicasa continued his soft chanting, weaving medicine into the very air. The reduction was quick and brutal. Tahon'teh's hands found the right position, and he pulled and rotated in one smooth motion. There was a wet pop as the joint slid back into place, and Ayasha's scream echoed off the canyon walls, a raw animal sound of agony. Then it was done, and she was gasping, tears streaming down her face, but her shoulder was back where it belonged. Wicasa moved to her next, binding the joint to prevent re-injury, working with the same care he had shown the Apache girl. As the sun began its descent, painting the tops of the canyon walls orange and gold while leaving the floor in deep shadow. The 5 survivors found themselves sitting in a rough circle, each lost in their own pain and shock and confusion. They had not spoken beyond the necessities of tending wounds. They had not introduced themselves. They remained in their minds, enemies forced into proximity by disaster. But necessity has a way of breaking down walls that hatred builds. It was Wicasa who spoke first, as the temperature began to drop and it became clear that a cold night was coming without shelter or fire. He spoke of practical things, the need for warmth, the danger of exposure for those who were injured, the reality that Nayeli would likely die if they did not keep her warm through the night. He spoke without emotion, simply laying out facts that could not be argued with. Tahon'teh listened and knew the old man was right. He began gathering wood from the debris pieces of brush and scrub that had been growing in the canyon before the avalanche buried it. His ribs protested every movement, but he ignored the pain. Pauki, his good arm working, helped gather smaller kindling. Even Ayasha, one-armed and exhausted, dragged over larger pieces. Creating fire became their second act of unwitting cooperation. Wicasa had the tools for it, and his hands were still steady despite the pain in his leg. He built the fire carefully, speaking prayers over it, as if apologizing to the wood for burning, thanking the spark for catching. When the flames finally rose, casting dancing light and blessed heat into the cold canyon, all 5 felt something shift, a barrier crossed, a threshold passed. They sat around the fire as darkness fell completely, the stars invisible above the dust that still hung in the air. For a long time no one spoke. They simply existed in the space together, 5 enemies sharing warmth, the crackling of flames the only sound. It was Nayeli who broke the silence, though she did not mean to. She stirred, moaning softly, her eyes opening to slits. She saw the fire, saw faces around her, and panic spiked through her. She tried to sit up, tried to reach for the knife that was not there, and the movement tore at her wound. She cried out, a sound of pain and fear mixed together. Wicasa spoke to her softly in the trader's tongue, telling her to be still, that she was hurt, that she needed to rest. She did not understand all the words, but the tone was gentle, calming. Her eyes found Tahon'teh, and she recognized him, the Cheyenne from before the avalanche. He should have been standing over her with a knife. Instead, he was holding out a water skin, offering her drink. She took the water, her hands shaking, and drank deeply. The questions in her eyes were clear, even if she did not voice them. Where am I? Why am I alive? Why are you helping me? No one had answers that made sense. So instead, they remained silent, and after a moment, Nayeli sank back down, too weak to do anything but accept the inexplicable mercy of the moment. The night grew colder. They had no blankets, no shelter beyond the meager protection of the canyon walls. The fire helped, but it was not enough. Hypothermia was a real danger, especially for Nayeli and Wicasa, their bodies weakened by injury. It was Ayasha who moved first, shifting closer to the fire, and then closer still, until she was sitting pressed against Pauki's side. The Hopi boy stiffened at first, terrified, but the warmth of her body against his was undeniable, and slowly he relaxed. Tahon'teh moved to Nayeli's other side, positioning himself to share heat, to help keep the wounded girl alive through the night. Wicasa sat cross-legged despite his broken leg, his body forming part of the circle, his presence somehow holding them together through sheer force of spiritual will. They sat like that through the long night, 5 people from 5 warring tribes, sharing warmth and fire and the simple animal need to survive until morning. No one spoke. No one named the strange thing that was happening among them. But as the stars wheeled overhead and the temperature dropped toward freezing, something fundamental had shifted. They had become, in the most basic sense, a group. US rather than 5 separate eyes. It was the beginning, though none of them recognized it yet. Dawn came cold and gray, the sun struggling to penetrate the dust-heavy air. Tahon'teh woke first, his warrior's instincts pulling him from sleep the moment the light changed. For a confused moment, he did not remember where he was or why his body hurt so completely. Then it all came flooding back, the avalanche, the shooting, the long cold night pressed against an Apache girl to keep her from freezing. He looked down at Nayeli, still sleeping fitfully, her face drawn and pale but her breathing steady. She lived. Against all odds she lived. He carefully extracted himself from her side and stood, his cracked ribs protesting. The canyon looked even worse in the dawn light, a chaos of shattered stone, the walls scarred and raw, the path utterly obliterated in both directions. They were well and truly trapped. Ayasha woke next, pulling away from Pauki with a start, momentarily forgetting how they had come to be huddled together. The Hopi boy was still sleeping, his broken arm cradled against his chest, tear tracks dried on his young face. She looked at him and felt something she had not expected: pity. He was barely more than a child, terrified and hurt, far from home. An enemy, yes, but also just a boy. Wicasa had not truly slept, the pain in his leg too intense, his mind too full of visions and portents. He had spent the night in a kind of waking meditation, existing in the space between worlds, listening to what the spirits were trying to tell him. Now in the pale morning light, some of it was becoming clearer, but not all. Not yet. They assessed their situation in the harsh light of day. The canyon was blocked completely in both directions, walls too sheer to climb. The only way out would be to dig through the rubble, a task that would take days even for healthy people, perhaps weeks for a group of injured survivors with no tools. They had one waterskin between them, perhaps a day's worth of water for 5 people if they were careful. Food was non-existent. Of weapons, they had only Tahon'teh's knife, which he had retrieved, and the useless empty rifle that Ayasha had dropped. Pauki woke last, crying out in pain as he jarred his broken arm. The sound brought the others' attention to him, and he cringed under their gazes, certain that now in the light of day, they would remember he was Hopi and therefore an enemy to all of them, but no one moved to hurt him. They simply stared, the same exhausted, confused stares they gave each other. It was as they were taking stock that Tahon'teh noticed something that made his blood run cold. He was examining the cliff face where the avalanche had originated, trying to understand what had caused such a catastrophic collapse, when he saw them scorch marks. Black stains on the stone, patterns that looked familiar to anyone who had ever seen the new blasting powder that miners and railroad men used to clear rock. He climbed carefully over the rubble to get a closer look, ignoring the screaming of his ribs, and found what he both expected and dreaded. Metal fragments, the twisted remains of containers, the unmistakable evidence of an explosion. He turned back to the others, his face grim, and held up a piece of torn metal. He did not speak, but his expression said everything. This was not an accident. This was not the work of unstable stone or bad weather. This was deliberate. Ayasha saw what he held and understood immediately. She had seen blasting powder used before, had watched miners clear paths through rock. She crossed to where Tahon'teh stood and examined the evidence herself, her warrior's mind already working through the implications. Someone had done this. Someone had buried them here deliberately, but why? Wicasa spoke then, his voice rough from a night without water. He told them about his visions, about the dreams that had driven him into these mountains. 5 people, he said. 5 tribes. Fire and blood and stone. He had been brought here by the spirits to find something, to understand something. And now he believed he knew what it was. They were not here by accident. None of them were. They had been gathered, collected like pieces on a game board, for a purpose he did not yet fully comprehend. The others listened with varying degrees of skepticism. Tahon'teh had respect for holy men, but was a practical warrior who trusted his eyes more than visions. Ayasha had her own spiritual traditions, but was also pragmatic. Pauki believed in the spirit world completely and was terrified by what the old man was suggesting. Nayeli, still weak, heard the words through the haze of pain and exhaustion. They spent the morning searching the canyon more carefully, and what they found deepened the mystery. More evidence of blasting powder, strategically placed. Signs that someone had been preparing this site for days, maybe weeks, prying at weak points in the cliff face, drilling holes for charges, creating the perfect conditions for catastrophic failure. And more damning still, they found tracks, boot prints, not moccasin prints. The tracks of horses wearing metal shoes. White men had been here. Or someone who wanted them to think white men had been here. But why target them specifically? None of them were chiefs or leaders. They were just 5 people from 5 different tribes, traveling alone for their own private reasons. What did they have in common that would make them worth killing? It was Nayeli who made the connection, speaking through her pain and broken trader's tongue. She told them why she was traveling carrying medicine for her grandmother, risking enemy territory out of love. She told them the route she had been planning to take, the places she intended to stop. And as she spoke, understanding began to dawn in the others. Tahon'teh had been scouting for a new trade route, one that would open commerce between his people and distant tribes to the east. Ayasha had been tracking a wolf, yes, but the trail had led her far from her usual hunting grounds, into territories where the crow had been considering expanding their influence. Wicasa had been drawn by visions, but those visions had mentioned a great gathering, a council of tribes that was being planned for the first time in generations. And Pauki sweet, terrified Pauki was carrying messages about trade alliances between his people and others. They were all, in different ways, parts of a larger movement toward peace, tentative, fragile, but real. The tribes had been fighting for so long that warfare had become the default, but exhaustion was setting in. Too many dead, too few young warriors, too much suffering. Voices were being raised in councils across the territories, asking if there might be another way. And these 5, unknowingly, had all been small players in that movement toward reconciliation. Someone wanted that movement stopped. Someone wanted the tribes to remain at war. And killing 5 people from 5 different tribes in a single incident, making it look like an ambush, a betrayal, would reignite hatreds that were just beginning to cool. The implications settled over them like a weight. They were not just trapped. They were pieces in someone's scheme, pawns in a game of manipulation whose stakes were measured in rivers of blood. The revelation changed everything. They were no longer 5 random victims of disaster. They were targets marked for death because of what they represented, a hope, however small, that the endless cycle of revenge and retaliation might finally be broken. And they were trapped together, with someone watching, waiting for them to die so that their deaths could be used to start a new war. Tahon'teh paced the confines of their prison, his mind working through the strategic implications. He had fought in enough raids and battles to understand how manipulation worked, how a single incident could be used to inflame passions and drive people to violence. He imagined his own people discovering his body alongside Apache and Crow dead. The immediate assumption would be betrayal. Ambush, proof that the peace talks were foolish dreams. The same calculations would happen in every tribe. Each would blame the others. The fragile threads of dialogue would snap, and the bloodshed would begin anew, worse than before, because it would be fueled by the bitter taste of betrayed hope. Someone understood this. Someone had planned it with cold precision. And that someone was almost certainly still out there, waiting to see if their trap had worked. Ayasha watched the Cheyenne warrior pace and recognized the calculations happening behind his eyes. She had made the same ones herself. Her mind kept returning to a conversation she had overheard weeks ago, before she set out on the wolf hunt. Traders had come through Crow territory, white men with goods and whiskey and smooth words. They had been asking questions about tribal movements, about who was traveling where, about the rumors of peace councils. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Traders always asked questions. But now, trapped here, the memory took on a sinister weight. She spoke haltingly, in the trade tongue, telling the others what she remembered. The traders had been particularly interested in routes through the mountains, in who might be traveling alone, in the timing of various journeys. They had paid well for information, and people had talked freely, seeing no harm in it. Wicasa listened and nodded slowly. He too had encountered such men, though further north, asking similar questions among his people. At the time, he had felt a disturbance in his spirit, a sense that something was wrong about them, but he had been focused on his visions and had not pursued the feeling. Now he understood. They had been gathering intelligence, mapping out where their targets would be and when. The avalanche site had been chosen with care, a place where multiple trails converged, where travelers from different directions might be caught together. Pauki's contribution was quieter but equally damning. He had seen white traders meeting with a Hopi man who had long been suspected of taking bribes, feeding information to outsiders. The man had been involved in disputes about whether the Hopi should join the peace talks or remain isolated. Pauki had thought the meetings were about trade goods, but now he wondered if information about his own journey had been sold, his route and timing handed over for a price. The picture emerging was clear and ugly. Someone, almost certainly the white traders Ayasha and Wicasa had encountered, had orchestrated this. They had gathered intelligence about 5 specific people from 5 specific tribes, all of whom were connected, however tangentially, to the movement toward peace. They had manipulated those 5 people into converging on this canyon on the same day, and they had tried to bury them all in one catastrophic event that would be interpreted as intertribal violence. But why? What did white traders care whether the tribes made peace or continued fighting? It was Tahon'teh who spoke the answer they were all beginning to see. War was profitable. As long as the tribes fought each other, they could not unite against outside threats. As long as they bled each other, they could not resist the encroachment of settlers, railroads, and mining operations. And as long as they needed weapons, ammunition, and trade goods to sustain their conflicts, certain traders could grow very rich indeed. Peace would end that. Peace would allow the tribes to negotiate from strength, to resist together rather than die separately. Peace was bad for business. The realization settled over them like a shroud. They had been marked for death not by ancient enemies, but by men motivated by simple greed. Their tribe's hatred for one another was just a tool, a lever to be pulled to keep the gold flowing. And 5 lives were a small price to pay to ensure the chaos continued. Nayeli, listening through her pain, felt something crack open inside her chest, a fury so pure, it burned hotter than her wound's fever. She had risked everything to save her grandmother, had walked into enemy territory armed only with hope and courage, and it had all been used against her. They had all been used. Their courage, their duty, their love, all of it twisted into a weapon pointed at their own people. She spoke then, her voice weak but fierce, in a mix of Apache and trade tongue that the others struggled to follow but understood in spirit. She said they had to get out, had to warn their people, had to expose what had been done. They could not let their deaths be used to start a war. They had to survive together and tell the truth. The others agreed, but the question remained: how? They were injured, trapped, with minimal supplies and no clear way out. The rubble blocking both ends of the canyon was massive, tons of stone that would take days to shift even with proper tools and healthy bodies. They had perhaps a day's water remaining. No food. Exposure and dehydration would kill them long before they could dig their way free. Unless there was another way. Wicasa had been studying the canyon walls during this conversation, his old eyes tracking the patterns of stone, the way water had carved and shaped the rock over countless years. He saw what the others had missed, a narrow chimney crack running up the southern wall, nearly invisible in the shadows, but there nonetheless. It was perhaps 2 feet wide at its base, narrowing as it rose, but it seemed to reach all the way to the rim. A path, impossibly dangerous, perhaps unclimbable in their condition, but a path nonetheless. He pointed it out, and the others came to look. Tahon'teh assessed it with a warrior's eye and shook his head. Even healthy and uninjured, it would be a brutal climb. With cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, a broken leg, A broken arm, and a gunshot wound among them. It was suicide. They would fall. They would die. The canyon floor would claim them just as surely as thirst or exposure. But Ayasha was already studying the crack, her mind working through the climbing problem. She had scaled cliffs before, hunting mountain sheep in crow territory. This was worse, much worse, but not impossible, not quite. The crack was narrow enough to chimney pressing back and shoulders against one wall, feet against the other, working upward through pure friction and determination. The main problem was the injuries. She could climb one-armed if she had to. Tahon'teh could manage despite his ribs if he was careful. But Wicasa's broken leg made him immobile. Pauki's broken arm would make it nearly impossible to maintain the friction needed, and Nayeli could barely stand, let alone climb. They stood in silence, each doing the same terrible calculation. Some of them might make it out. Some of them could climb that crack and escape to bring warning. But not all. Not together. Someone would have to be left behind. It was Wicasa who spoke the truth they were all avoiding. He said he would stay. His leg was broken, he was old, and the spirits had brought him here to ensure the others survived. He would remain and tend the fire, conserve the water, and pray that the others would make it in time to stop the war. His voice was calm, accepting, the voice of a man who had already made peace with his death. But Nayeli shook her head violently, the motion making her gasp with pain. No one would be abandoned. If they could not all climb, then they would not climb at all. They would find another way, or they would die here together, but she would not allow anyone to be sacrificed. Her eyes blazed with a determination that transcended her injuries, her youth, her weakness. She had saved one life yesterday, the Cheyenne's. She would not watch another be thrown away today. The others stared at this fierce Apache girl who should have died hours ago, who should have been their enemy, and felt something shift again. Tahon'teh found himself smiling despite everything, despite the pain and fear and impossible situation. She was right. The whole point, the whole reason they had been targeted, was that they represented something new, something that transcended the old hatreds. To leave one behind would be to surrender to those hatreds, to accept that some lives mattered more than others based on tribe and blood. It would make them the same as the men who had tried to kill them. So they would have to find a way to get everyone out. All five, or they would die trying. The preparation took hours they could not afford. They gathered what little they had, strips of leather cut from their clothing, the leather thong from Wicasa's medicine bundle, a length of sinew Ayasha had been carrying. Woven together, it made a rope of sorts, perhaps 15 feet long, nowhere near enough to reach the canyon rim, but enough to help secure the weakest climbers during the most difficult sections. Tahon'teh would go first, blazing the trail, finding the holes and friction points. Ayasha would follow, carrying the makeshift rope. Then Pauki, his broken arm bound tightly to his chest. Wicasa would come next, climbing with one good leg and 2 arms. His strength and determination all that stood between him and a fatal fall. And last Nayeli, so weak she could barely stand, strapped to Tahon'teh's back because there was no other way. It was a plan born of desperation rather than reason. Every part of it was impossible. But the impossible was all they had left. They drank the last of the water, dividing it equally despite Wicasa's insistence that the younger ones needed it more. They said prayers, each in their own language, to their own spirits. Wicasa performed a brief ceremony, blessing each of them, asking the mountain to grant them passage, apologizing for disturbing the stone. The prayers mixed together in the canyon air, Cheyenne and Apache and Lakota and Crow and Hopi, 5 traditions that had rarely been spoken in the same place without bloodshed, now woven together in shared hope. When they were ready, or as ready as they would ever be, Tahon'teh approached the crack. Up close, it looked even more forbidding, narrow, dark, the stone smooth and unforgiving. He placed his hands on either wall, feeling for purchase, and began to climb. The technique was brutally simple and brutally difficult. Back pressed against one wall, feet against the other. He inched upward by pushing outward with his legs while his back scraped against stone. Every movement sent fire through his cracked ribs. Every breath was a study in controlled agony. But he moved foot by foot, refusing to think about the drop below or the distance still above. He focused on the next hold, the next push, the next moment of survival. 20 feet up, he found a slight ledge, barely 6 inches wide, but enough to rest on. He wedged himself there and called down for Ayasha. She came up fast, moving with the confidence of someone who had spent her life in wild country. Her injured shoulder slowed her but did not stop her. When she reached Tahon'teh's position, she clipped the rope around her waist and secured it to a narrow outcropping of rock, creating a crude belay system. Pauki came next, terror written across his young face. He had never climbed anything higher than a mesa ladder, had never tested himself against stone and sky. But Ayasha called encouragement to him in the trade tongue, and Tahon'teh added his voice. And somehow the Hopi boy found courage he did not know he possessed. He climbed awkwardly, one-armed, his broken limb a dead weight against his chest, but he climbed. When he slipped halfway up, the rope caught him, and Ayasha's good arm held firm, despite the wrenching pain in her shoulder. He dangled for a moment, sobbing in fear, and then he resumed climbing, driven by something deeper than courage, by the simple refusal to let the others down. Wicasa took longer. The old holy man climbed with his broken leg hanging useless, using only his arms and one good leg, pulling himself up through sheer will and spiritual strength. He sang as he climbed, the old songs, the sacred songs, his voice echoing in the narrow crack. The words were power-made sound, and they carried him upward even when his strength was gone. When he reached the others, his face was gray with pain and exhaustion, but his eyes were still clear, still focused on what must be done. Then came Nayeli. Tahon'teh descended back to the canyon floor, and together with Ayasha, they fashioned a carrying system from what remained of their rope and leather strips. Nayeli was strapped to Tahon'teh's back, her arms around his neck, her wounded side pressed against him. She could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, strong and steady, and she used it as an anchor against the waves of pain and fever that threatened to drag her under. The climb with her on his back was the hardest thing Tahon'teh had ever done. Every foothold, every press outward with his legs, sent Nayeli's weight shifting on his back, driving spikes of agony through his cracked ribs. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold. His vision blurred. His muscles screamed. But he did not stop, could not stop. The Apache girl on his back had saved his life yesterday. Today, he would return the favor, or he would fall trying. Above, Ayasha and Pauki and Wicasa called encouragement, gave guidance on holds, helped pull when the rope allowed. They had become a team, a unit, 5 parts working as one. When Tahon'teh's foot slipped and he began to slide, it was Wicasa's strong grip on the rope that stopped him. When Pauki nearly lost his hold from exhaustion, it was Ayasha's voice that rallied him. They were climbing together, surviving together, transcending everything they had been taught about who was friend and who was foe. The crack narrowed as they climbed higher, the walls pressing closer, the friction that held them also threatening to trap them. 80 feet up, 100, more than enough to kill them if they fell. The canyon floor was a distant memory below. Above, the rim was closer but still so far, impossibly far. Tahon'teh's strength finally gave out 50 feet from the top. His legs simply stopped working, the muscles turned to water, and he sagged in the crack, held only by friction and the rope around his waist. Nayeli felt him stop and knew he could go no further. She spoke into his ear, her voice barely a whisper, telling him to rest, to breathe, that they were almost there. But Tahon'teh knew better. Almost there meant nothing. He either reached the top or they both died here, wedged in stone like insects preserved in amber. It was Ayasha who saved them. She climbed back down, moving with desperate speed despite her injuries, and positioned herself below Tahon'teh. Using the rope and a technique she had learned hunting in the mountains, She created a kind of pulley system with the outcropping above, and she and Pauki and Wicasa pulled together. It should not have worked. 3 injured people should not have been able to haul 2 others up 50 feet of vertical stone, but they did. Inch by agonizing inch, they raised Tahon'teh and Nayeli toward the rim, and the Cheyenne warrior used what little strength remained to help, pushing with his legs even when he thought he had nothing left. The last 20 feet were a blur of pain and effort and prayer. The sun was setting, painting the canyon walls red and gold, and in that fading light, 5 people emerged at the top of the crack, crawling out onto the rim of the canyon like souls escaping from the underworld. They lay there, gasping, bleeding, broken, alive. The sky was enormous above them, the first stars beginning to appear. None of them spoke. They simply breathed, and the act of breathing, of being alive when they should have been dead, was triumph enough. They gave themselves the luxury of an hour's rest before acknowledging the reality of their situation. They had escaped the canyon, but they were still in hostile wilderness, still injured, still without water or food, and still being hunted by whoever had triggered the avalanche. Survival demanded they move, but in which direction? And toward what goal? The discussion that followed was conducted in the broken trade tongue that was becoming their shared language, supplemented with gestures and drawings in the dirt. Wicasa spoke of the great gathering that had been planned, a council of tribes that was meant to take place in the valley of the 3 rivers, 8 days' journey to the north. If they could reach it, if they could present their evidence and tell their story, they might have a chance to prevent the war their deaths were meant to start. But 8 days for healthy travelers was more like 15 in their condition, perhaps longer. And they had no supplies, no weapons beyond Tahon'teh, no means of hunting or carrying water. The odds of all 5 making it were essentially 0, unless they could find help along the way. Ayasha knew of a crow hunting camp 2 days' journey to the west. But bringing Cheyenne, Apache, Lakota, and Hopi into a crow camp was asking to start the very war they were trying to prevent. Tahon'teh spoke of a Cheyenne village 3 days to the east, but the same problem applied. Everywhere they turned, their presence together was a provocation, proof of something so unnatural it would be seen as threat or trickery. It was Pauki who offered the most pragmatic solution. There was a trading post a day and a half away, run by a French trapper who cared nothing for tribal politics and everything for profit. He would sell them supplies if they had anything to trade, and he would ask no questions because questions were bad for business. It was not ideal, but it was possible. They set out as soon as the moon rose, traveling by its silver light because they could not afford to wait for dawn. Wicasa walked with the staff they had fashioned from a dead tree, his broken leg bound with strips torn from everyone's clothing. Each step was agony, but he took them anyway. Nayeli rode on Tahon'teh's back again, too weak to walk, her fever climbing despite Wicasa's medicines. Ayasha scouted ahead despite her injured shoulder, her warrior's instincts guiding them around obstacles and threats. Pauki stayed close to Wicasa, ready to help if the old man fell, his broken arm throbbing but his spirit stronger than it had ever been. They moved through a landscape of moonlight and shadow, crossing ridges and descending into valleys, always heading south toward the trading post. They found water in a stream near midnight and drank deeply, the cold liquid like a blessing. They saw a deer in the distance but had no way to bring it down. They gathered berries that Wicasa identified as safe, eating them slowly to avoid overwhelming their empty stomachs. As they traveled, they talked. There was nothing else to do in the long hours of walking, and silence had become uncomfortable. It left too much room for old thoughts, old hatreds to creep back in. So they spoke instead, sharing their stories, their histories, their reasons for being on that mountain trail. Tahon'teh spoke of his brother, killed by Apache raiders 2 winters past. He described the grief that had consumed him, the rage that had driven him to volunteer for every war party, every raid, always seeking the death that might balance the scales. He talked about the moment when Nayeli had thrown herself in front of Ayasha's bullet, and how that moment had cracked something open inside him. He had spent 2 years seeing Apaches as a single mass of enemies, forgetting that each one was a person with a story, with people who loved them. Nayeli's sacrifice had reminded him, had shamed him, had shown him what he had let himself become. Nayeli, in her fever dreams, spoke of her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after her parents died of the white man's diseases. She talked about learning medicine from her, about the sacred responsibility of healing, about how the Apache had once been great healers before war had consumed so much of their culture. She spoke of the irony that she now carried a Cheyenne bullet in her body, fired by a crow, and yet she was being saved by both. The world made no sense anymore, and perhaps that was good. Perhaps sense was overrated when it only led to endless cycles of revenge. Ayasha told them about her father, the great hunter, killed in a raid on a Cheyenne camp that had turned out to be the wrong camp, a peaceful group, not the war party they had been seeking. She had been 12 when it happened, and she had vowed to become a warrior like him, to make his death mean something. But she had never asked the question that now haunted her. What did it mean? How did more killing honor killing? Her father had died in a mistake, a case of wrong place and wrong time, and she had spent 11 years trying to make that mistake make sense through violence. Maybe it was time to try something else. Wicasa spoke of visions and spirits, of the web of connection that bound all living things together. He told them that the tribes had not always been at war, that there were stories from the old times when the people gathered in peace, trading and sharing and celebrating together. The wars had started later, driven by scarcity and fear and the manipulations of outsiders who found it useful to keep the tribes divided. He said he had once believed the old times could never return, that too much blood had been spilled for peace to ever take root. But now, watching 5 people who should have been enemies helping each other survive, he was beginning to hope again. Pauki talked last, and his story was simplest. He was afraid, had always been afraid. Afraid of violence, afraid of war, afraid of the other tribes and the white men and the whole brutal world. He had become a message carrier precisely because it kept him away from fighting, but even that had not saved him from finding himself in the middle of disaster. And yet, walking now through the night with these 4 warriors who should have terrified him, he felt less afraid than he ever had. Because they had seen him at his weakest crying, broken, useless, and they had helped him anyway. They had not mocked his fear or used his weakness against him. They had simply helped him climb. The stories wove around them as they walked, creating a tapestry of shared humanity that was stronger than the tribal identities that had defined them. They were still Cheyenne and Apache and Lakota and Crow and Hopi, but they were also something new, something that had no name yet, but was real nonetheless. They reached the trading post near dawn of the 2nd day, half dead from exhaustion, dehydration, and pain. The post was a ramshackle affair of logs and sod, built against a hillside, with a corral for horses and a small garden protected by a crude fence. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the smell of coffee, actual coffee, nearly made them weep. The owner emerged as they approached, a grizzled French-Canadian named Dufresne, who had been trading with the tribes for 30 years. He took one look at the 5 of them, battered, bloody, from 5 different tribes, helping each other walk, and his eyes went very wide. He said nothing for a long moment, simply staring, and then he waved them inside with a gesture that suggested he had seen many strange things in his life, but this might be the strangest. Inside, the trading post was cluttered with goods, blankets, knives, coffee, sugar, whiskey, ammunition, everything a person might need in the wilderness and everything the tribes might trade for. Dufresne sat them down, brought them water and hardtack, and studied them with the calculating eye of a man who made his living reading people and situations. It was Tahon'teh who did the talking, his command of the French trader's language better than the others. He explained carefully what had happened, the avalanche, the evidence of sabotage, the manipulation, their need to reach the tribal gathering with proof of the conspiracy. He did not ask for charity, that would have been insulting. He offered trade instead. They had little, but they had some things of value. Nayeli's beaded medicine bag, Ayasha's knife, beautifully crafted, Wicasa's medicine bundle, which contained items that would be valuable to the right buyer, Pauki's good moccasins, Tahon'teh's own silver armband, a gift from his father. Dufresne examined each item, his face unreadable. Then he named his price. The items they offered were worth perhaps enough for 2 days' supplies. Not enough to get them where they needed to go. Not nearly enough. But as they began to argue, to offer more, Dufresne held up his hand. He told them something they had not known, something that changed everything. Other traders had been through recently Americans, not French, which was unusual in this territory. They had been asking questions, lots of questions, about the avalanche in the mountain pass, about whether anyone had come through, about whether 5 people from 5 tribes might have been seen together. And they had been offering money, good money, for information about such people. The implications were clear. The men who had tried to kill them knew they might have survived, were actively looking for them, and were trying to buy information from people like Dufresne to track them down and finish the job. Dufresne looked at the 5 survivors, at their injuries and exhaustion and desperate determination, and made his choice. He said he was a businessman, yes, but he was also a man who had lived among the tribes long enough to respect them. And the idea that someone was trying to manipulate them into a war disgusted him. Wars were bad for business, his kind of business anyway, the kind based on long-term relationships rather than quick profits from weapons sales. So he offered them a deal. He would give them supplies, food, water skins, blankets, medicine, a rifle with ammunition. In exchange, they would take nothing except their lives and their mission. The debt would be forgiven if they succeeded in stopping the war. If they failed, well, the debt would not matter because they would probably be dead, and he would probably be dead, and everyone would probably be dead in the bloodbath that would follow. It was the kind of deal only a man who had spent too long in the wilderness would make, equal parts practicality and sentiment, cold business sense wrapped around a core of human decency. The 5 survivors accepted, and Dufresne set about equipping them properly. As he worked, he told them more. The traders who had been asking questions were part of a larger operation run by a man named Colburn, a merchant out of St. Louis who had made his fortune supplying weapons and ammunition to both the U.S. Army and various tribes. He was known for his ruthlessness and his willingness to do whatever it took to keep his markets open. If the tribes made peace, Colburn stood to lose thousands in revenue. More than enough motivation for mass murder. But there was something else Dufresne knew, something even more valuable than supplies. The tribal gathering was not in 8 days as they had thought, it was in 4. The timing had been moved up because of escalating tensions, because both sides feared that war was about to break out again. They had even less time than they realized. 4 days, to cover terrain that would take 8. In their condition. Dufresne looked at them and shook his head. He said they would never make it. But he also said he had once seen a Lakota warrior walk 30 miles on a broken leg to bring warning of an attack. He had seen a Cheyenne woman give birth during a blizzard and walk out of the mountains carrying her infant 3 days later. He had seen the tribes do impossible things when necessity demanded it. Maybe 5 people from 5 tribes, united in purpose, could do one more impossible thing. They rested at the trading post for 4 hours, eating real food, drinking clean water, letting Dufresne's wife, a Métis woman who appeared from the back room, tend to their wounds with proper medicine and clean bandages. The care was as valuable as the supplies. Wicasa's leg was splinted correctly. Nayeli's wound was cleaned and redressed. Ayasha's shoulder was braced more securely. Pauki's arm was set and wrapped. Tahon'teh's ribs were bound tightly. As they were preparing to leave, Dufresne gave them one more thing, a map, hand-drawn, showing the fastest route to the gathering place. It cut through territories that all of them would normally avoid, places where the dangers were well known. but it would save them 2 days if they could survive it. They left the trading post in mid-morning, supplied and somewhat rested, facing a journey that would test everything they had already endured. Behind them, Dufresne and his wife watched them go. The old trader was betting his supplies and possibly his life that 5 traditional enemies could change the world. It was, he reflected, the worst bet he had ever made from a business standpoint. But maybe, just maybe, it was the best. The next 4 days were a crucible that burned away everything except the essential core of who they were and what they were becoming. They walked through territories that would have been suicidal for any of them alone, but together they passed through strange protection. A crow hunting party saw them and instead of attacking, simply stared in confusion at the impossible sight of their own warrior traveling with ancient enemies, helping them rather than killing them. A Cheyenne war party intercepted them, and Tahon'teh stood before his own people and told them to let the others pass, that something larger than old feuds was at stake. The warriors let them go, more from shock than agreement, but they let them go. Word began to spread ahead of them, carried by those who saw them, 5 people from 5 tribes, injured but unbowed, traveling together toward the great gathering. The story seemed impossible, like a legend or a lie, but too many people saw them for it to be dismissed entirely. Confusion rippled through the tribes. Questions were asked that had no easy answers. What did it mean? Was it a trick, a betrayal, or was it something else entirely? Nayeli's fever broke on the 2nd day out from Dufresne's post, and she insisted on walking rather than being carried. She was weak, leaning on Pauki for support, but she walked. Her wound was healing, slowly, but it was healing. Wicasa's chanting and medicine, combined with her own young strength, were winning the battle against infection and blood loss. Each step was difficult, but each step was also a victory. Wicasa's leg would never heal properly while walking, but he had given up caring about proper healing. He would walk until he reached the gathering or until his leg fell off, whichever came first. The pain had become a constant companion, almost a friend, something to focus on when doubt threatened to overwhelm him. His visions had grown clearer each day. He saw the gathering now, saw the moment when they would arrive, saw the faces of the chiefs and warriors who would listen or refuse to listen. The future was not fixed, but it was approaching fast. Ayasha found herself changing in ways she could not fully articulate. The warrior's mindset that had defined her for 11 years, the constant vigilance, the readiness for violence, the seeing of the world in terms of enemies and allies, was starting to crack. She watched Tahon'teh help Nayeli walk and remembered that she had shot this girl, this Apache who had saved a Cheyenne's life. She watched Pauki find courage in helping Wicasa and saw that strength came in forms she had never considered. She was still a warrior, would always be a warrior, but maybe being a warrior meant more than just killing. Maybe it meant protecting, even when what you protected was strange and uncomfortable and challenged everything you thought you knew. Tahon'teh discovered that his grief, carried for 2 years like armor, was beginning to transmute into something else. His brother's death still mattered, would always matter, but the meaning of it was changing. He had thought honoring his brother meant seeking revenge, meant adding Apache blood to the scales to balance what had been taken. But his brother had been a man who laughed easily, who had told stories around fires, who had been kind to children and generous to elders. Would that man have wanted his death to fuel more killing? Or would he have wanted something better, something that broke the cycle rather than feeding it? Pauki was still afraid, but he had learned that fear did not mean inability. He had climbed a canyon wall with a broken arm because there was no choice, and he had survived. He walked now through hostile country because it was necessary, and somehow he kept walking. The others did not mock his fear or try to talk him out of it. They simply accepted it as part of who he was, the way they accepted Wicasa's visions or Nayeli's fever or Ayasha's scarred shoulder. He was Pauki, and Pauki was afraid, and that was fine because Pauki also kept moving. On the 3rd night, camped in a high meadow under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, they talked about what would happen when they reached the gathering. The tribal council was meant to discuss the possibility of peace, but it was also a powder keg of barely controlled tensions. Old enemies would be in the same space, separated by only a few yards and generations of bloodshed. One wrong word, one perceived insult, and the whole thing could explode into violence. And into this volatile situation, they would walk 5 people who represented living proof that cooperation across tribal lines was possible, but also 5 people whose story suggested that outside forces were actively working to prevent that cooperation. How would the chiefs receive them? Would they be seen as heroes or traitors? Would their evidence be enough to convince skeptics, or would it be dismissed as lies and manipulation? They had no answers. They could only hope that the truth would be compelling enough, and that they would survive long enough to tell it. The 4th day dawned cold and gray, with storm clouds building on the horizon. They were close now, perhaps 6 hours from the gathering place if they pushed hard. They pushed hard, driving their battered bodies past every reasonable limit, fueled by desperation and purpose and something that had grown between them over these days, bond that had no name but was as real as the ground beneath their feet. They began to see other travelers on the trails now, groups heading toward the gathering, warriors in full regalia, chiefs with their retinues, medicine men and women, elders and youths. The tribes were converging, bringing with them all their hopes and fears and accumulated grudges. The looks that the 5 survivors received ranged from curiosity to hostility to outright shock. No one interfered with them, but no one helped them either. They were an aberration, a thing that did not fit into the world as it was known, and so people gave them space, uncertain how to react. They crested the final ridge as the sun was setting, and below them spread the valley of the 3 rivers. Hundreds of lodges were spread across the valley floor, organized by tribes Cheyenne to the east, Lakota to the north, Crow to the west, Apache to the south, and smaller groups scattered between. Fires were being lit against the gathering darkness. The smell of cooking food drifted up on the evening breeze. It was beautiful and terrifying, this gathering of peoples who had spent so long trying to kill each other. And they were about to walk into the heart of it. They descended into the valley as darkness fell, 5 shadows moving between the scattered lodges, drawing stares and whispers wherever they passed. Word of their approach had preceded them, the impossible 5, the mixed group, the survivors. No one stopped them, but everyone watched. The tension was thick enough to taste. The council fire burned at the center of the valley, where the 3 rivers met. Around it sat the chiefs and elders of every tribe represented, perhaps 40 people in all, the most powerful and influential leaders of the plains and mountains. They were deep in discussion when the 5 survivors emerged from the darkness into the firelight, and the conversation died as if cut with a knife. Tahon'teh stepped forward first, his head high despite the exhaustion and pain. He began to speak in the trader's tongue, knowing that most present would understand it, even if it was no one's first language. He told them who he was, who the others were, and what had happened to them. He told the story simply, without embellishment, the avalanche, the trap, the evidence of sabotage, the conspiracy to use their deaths to start a war. As he spoke, Nayeli moved to his side, showing her wound, testament to the violence that had been done to them, and also to the strange cooperation that had allowed them to survive. Ayasha came forward and displayed the metal fragments they had recovered, the evidence of the blasting powder. Wicasa spoke of his visions, of being called by spirits to witness and survive. Pauki, trembling but determined, told of the corrupt Hopi man who had sold information to white traders, information that had been used to target them all. The chiefs listened in silence, their faces unreadable. Some were openly skeptical, others were thoughtful. A few looked angry, though whether the anger was directed at the 5 survivors or at the story they were telling was unclear. It was a Cheyenne chief who spoke first, an old man named White Bear, who had led war parties against the Apache for 30 winters. He looked at Tahon'teh and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Why should they believe this story? How did they know it was not a trick, an elaborate deception meant to make them lower their guard so that enemies could strike. Tahon'teh met his chief's eyes and answered with a question of his own. He asked what he would gain from such a deception. He was Cheyenne, had fought for his people, had lost his brother to Apache blades. If he wanted to deceive the council, why would he bring an Apache girl with him? Why would he travel with a Crow warrior who had shot her? Why would he risk his life and honor on such an elaborate lie when he could simply have returned home and reported that his scouting mission had failed? The logic was sound, but logic was not always enough when emotions ran deep. An Apache chief stood next, a woman named Red Sky who had earned her position through both wisdom and fierceness. She looked at Nayeli and asked her directly in Apache, did the Cheyenne speak truth? Had she truly been willing to die to save his life? Nayeli answered in her own language, her voice weak but clear. She said she had acted without thinking, responding to an instinct deeper than tribal identity. She had seen a person about to die and had moved to prevent it, and only afterward had she realized that the person was Cheyenne. And in the days since, she had learned that her enemy could be honorable, could be kind, could carry her when she could not walk and tend her wounds when she was fevered. She did not ask her people to forget the past or to pretend that generations of conflict could be erased in a moment. She only asked them to consider that there might be another path forward, one that did not require the deaths of their children and grandchildren in endless cycles of revenge. Red Sky listened and nodded slowly, her expression softening slightly, but the skepticism remained in the circle. Too many had lost too much to be easily convinced. It was then that Colburn made his move. He had been watching from the shadows beyond the firelight, this American merchant with his smooth words and hidden agenda. He had paid informants throughout the valley, men from various tribes who were more interested in gold than honor. And now he activated them, sending them forward to speak against the 5 survivors, to suggest that this was indeed a trick, that the evidence was fabricated, that the whole story was designed to make the tribes weak and vulnerable to outside conquest. The accusations were clever, playing on every fear and suspicion the tribes held. They suggested that the white man's government was behind the deception, trying to convince the tribes to put down their weapons so that soldiers could sweep in and destroy them all. They pointed out that convenient it was that 5 people from 5 different tribes just happened to be caught in the same avalanche and just happened to survive and just happened to develop this bond of brotherhood. Was it not more likely that they had been planted by outside forces, trained to play on emotions and manipulate the council? The chiefs began to murmur, doubt spreading like fire through dry grass. The 5 survivors stood in the center of the circle, watching their credibility dissolve, seeing the moments slip away. They had come so far, endured so much, and now it was falling apart because the truth was too strange, too unprecedented to be easily believed. Wicasa raised his staff and struck the ground 3 times, the sharp cracks cutting through the growing chaos. He spoke then in a voice that carried despite his exhaustion, a voice that resonated with spiritual authority that even skeptics respected. He told them that he had seen this moment in his visions, had been shown that they would doubt and argue and nearly lose their way. But he had also been shown what would happen if they rejected the truth. He had seen the valley running with blood, had seen lodges burning, had seen children dying and elders weeping, and the tribes tearing themselves apart while their true enemies watched and profited. He told them that the spirits had sent 5 messengers because no single tribe would have been believed. 5 people from 5 tribes, each with their own reasons for being on that mountain, each with their own grudges and histories, brought together by fate or manipulation or divine will. It did not matter which. What mattered was what they represented. They represented a choice, a chance, a single opportunity to step away from the path that had been walked for so long that the feet of the people had worn grooves in the very earth. He told them that they could reject the message and the messengers, could send the 5 away and return to the comfortable patterns of hatred and revenge. Or they could take the harder path, the one that required them to question everything they had been taught, to imagine a world that did not yet exist, to become something new. The valley fell silent as Wicasa finished speaking. The old holy man swayed on his broken leg, exhausted beyond measure, but he remained standing through sheer force of will. And in that silence, something shifted. It was Red Sky who stood first. She walked to where Nayeli stood and looked at the girl's wound, at the bandages that had been changed by Cheyenne hands, at the evidence of survival against impossible odds. She spoke then, her voice carrying to every corner of the gathering. She said that she had lost a son to the crow 3 winters past, and that loss had carved a hole in her heart that would never fully heal. But she had also lost 2 daughters to white man's diseases, a nephew to a mining accident caused by careless settlers, and a brother to alcoholism brought by traders who sold poison to her people. The tribes had many enemies, and most of them were not each other. She said that she could not know for certain if the 5 survivors spoke truth. But she knew that her people were tired, that mothers were tired of sending sons to war, that children were tired of growing up without fathers. She knew that the Apache were being squeezed from all sides, settlers from the south, cavalry from the east, other tribes from the north and west. And she knew that alone, her people would eventually be crushed. But together, united with other tribes, there might be a chance. One by one, other chiefs stood to speak. Some remained skeptical, some were angry, but slowly a consensus began to emerge. The story the 5 survivors told made a terrible kind of sense. There were white traders, corrupt politicians, ruthless merchants who benefited from intertribal warfare, who sold weapons to both sides, who encouraged conflicts to keep the tribes weak and divided. It was not a comfortable truth, but that did not make it less true. And then Colburn revealed himself. He stepped forward from the shadows, confident, well-dressed, smiling his merchant smile. He spoke smoothly, addressing the council with the kind of oily charm that had served him well in a lifetime of manipulation. He suggested that the chiefs were being hasty, that they should not let themselves be swayed by emotional appeals and unlikely stories. He offered them weapons, modern rifles, good ammunition, supplies that would help them defend themselves against their enemies. He made it sound like generosity, like concern for their well-being. But Tahon'teh saw through it. He turned to the council and asked a simple question. Why would this white man care so much about what the tribes decided? Why would he be here, at this gathering, if not because he had a stake in the outcome? And what stake could he have except the one they had already identified, the profit motive, the desire to keep the tribes at war so that he could continue selling them the means to kill each other? Colburn's smile slipped. He tried to recover, to deflect, but Ayasha was already moving. She crossed to where he stood and with her good arm, grabbed the leather bag he carried over his shoulder. She dumped its contents onto the ground in front of the council fire. Maps fell out. Detailed maps showing tribal territories, trade routes, and most damningly, a map of the canyon where the avalanche had occurred, marked with notes about timing and placement of charges. Payment records showing bribes to tribal informants. Letters discussing the strategic advantage of keeping the tribes divided. And a telegram just days old from Colburn's partners in St. Louis, congratulating him on the success of the mountain operation and urging him to ensure that no survivors emerged to contradict the narrative. The evidence was damning, undeniable. Colburn tried to run, but warriors from multiple tribes seized him, and in that moment, they were not enemies, they were people united in fury against someone who had tried to manipulate them into murdering each other for profit. The trial of Colburn and his co-conspirators took 3 days. Chiefs from every tribe participated, and the judgment was unanimous. The traitors were exiled from tribal territories forever, their goods confiscated, their names to be remembered as examples of the treachery the people had against. It was not enough, nothing could truly balance the scales for what they had tried to do, but it was justice of a kind. More importantly, the revelation of the conspiracy became the catalyst for the conversations that followed. The chiefs debated for 5 more days, sometimes heatedly, sometimes calmly, working through generations of grievances and trying to imagine a different future. Not everyone was convinced. Some warriors left the gathering in disgust, rejecting the idea of peace. Some chiefs argued that the tribes were too different, had fought too long, had suffered too much to ever truly coexist. But others were willing to try. They forged agreements, tentative at first promises to cease raids, to establish neutral trading grounds, to arbitrate disputes through councils rather than warfare. They created protocols for communication between tribes, ways to handle violations of the peace that did not immediately escalate to violence. They acknowledged that it would be difficult, that there would be setbacks, that peace was harder than war in many ways. But they were willing to try. The 5 survivors became symbols of this new possibility, though they never sought such status. They were simply people who had survived together, and in surviving had discovered that the walls between them were not as insurmountable as they had been taught. They did not claim to have solved anything or to have overcome their tribal identities. They simply existed as proof that cooperation was possible, even under the worst circumstances. When the gathering ended and the tribes began to disperse, the 5 faced a question they had not fully considered. What happened now? They had been bound together by crisis and necessity, by the simple need to survive. But survival was accomplished. The warning had been delivered. The conspiracy had been exposed. They could return to their separate peoples, resume their separate lives, and let this strange chapter fade into memory. None of them wanted that. Tahon'teh returned to his Cheyenne people, but he carried with him the memory of an Apache girl who had saved his life and a Crow warrior who had tended his wounds. He spoke in councils about what he had learned, about the possibility of seeing beyond old hatreds. Some listened, some did not. But the seed was planted. Nayeli brought medicine to her grandmother, arriving in time to save her life with the herbs and knowledge she had gathered. And she told her grandmother about the Cheyenne warrior who had carried her when she could not walk, about the Lakota holy man who had healed her wounds, about the Crow warrior and Hopi messenger who had become her unlikely companions. Her grandmother listened and wept, not from grief but from something like hope. Ayasha returned to her Crow people as a warrior who had seen beyond the circle of firelight, who had learned that strength came in many forms. She continued to hunt, to fight when fighting was necessary, but she also became an advocate for the peace that had been negotiated. She carried scars in her shoulder and in her soul, but scars could be proof of survival as well as injury. Wicasa's broken leg healed badly, leaving him with a pronounced limp, but he wore it as a badge of honor, proof that he had walked the path his visions had shown him, proof that prophecy could be fulfilled even when the cost was high. He continued his work as a holy man, but now his visions included glimpses of a future that was different from the past, where the lodges of different tribes stood near each other without fear. Pauki returned to his Hopi mesas having discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving despite it. He was never a warrior, never comfortable with violence, but he found his place as a bridge between peoples, a messenger who could travel because he represented no threat. His broken arm healed stronger than before, and so did his spirit. They stayed in contact, these 5, through messages and rare meetings at trading posts and neutral grounds. They aged, as all people do, and the world continued its brutal work around them. The peace held in some places and broke in others. There were still raids, still violence, still suffering. The transformation they represented did not happen overnight, did not spread like wildfire to consume the old ways. But it happened. Slowly, a new lodge built near an old enemy's camp, a marriage between tribes, a shared hunting ground, a council that resolved a dispute without bloodshed. Small things, easily overlooked, but small things had a way of adding up to something larger. Years later, when the 5 were old and the frontier had changed beyond recognition, they gathered one last time at the canyon where it had all begun. Someone had placed a cairn there, a pile of stones marking the spot where 5 people from 5 tribes had been meant to die and had instead chosen to live. They sat together, these old friends, and remembered. They remembered the terror and pain, the impossible climb, the long journey through hostile territory. They remembered the moment when Nayeli had thrown herself in front of a bullet, the moment when Tahon'teh had carried her on his back, the moment when they had all pressed together for warmth on that first cold night. They remembered becoming something more than the sum of their separate selves. Wicasa spoke first, his voice still strong despite his years. He said that he had spent his life seeing visions of what might be, trying to interpret the messages the spirits sent. But the greatest vision had not been the one he had dreamed before the avalanche. It had been the one he had lived after, the vision of 5 enemies becoming 5 friends, of hatred transforming into trust, of the impossible becoming real simply because it was necessary. Tahon'teh agreed, his scarred face creasing in a smile. He said he had spent 2 years trying to honor his brother through revenge, and it had only made him hollow. But honoring his brother by helping to end a war, by showing that another path was possible, that had given meaning to the loss in a way that violence never could. Nayeli, her hair now streaked with gray, spoke of the grandmother she had saved, who had lived another 20 years and had seen the beginning of peace between tribes. She spoke of the children she had taught medicine to, Apache and Cheyenne and others, learning side by side. She spoke of wounds that healed and walls that came down. Ayasha talked about the hunts she had shared with former enemies, about the stories told around fires where multiple languages mixed and no one reached for weapons. She talked about her daughter, who had married a Lakota man and whose children carried the blood of 2 tribes that had once tried to destroy each other. Pauki, still somewhat timid even in old age, spoke quietly about the messages he had carried over the decades, watching as the content of those messages shifted from threats and demands to invitations and offers of alliance. He spoke about the fear that had never fully left him, but had taught him that survival sometimes meant being uncomfortable, meant moving forward even when every instinct screamed to hide. They sat in silence then, 5 old people at a cairn of stones, watching the sun set over the frontier that had shaped them. The world was still hard, still cruel in many ways. The tribes still struggled, still suffered under the pressure of settler expansion and broken treaties. The peace they had helped create was imperfect, incomplete, always under threat. But it was there, it existed. It had grown from the moment when 5 people chose to help each other instead of kill each other, chose to trust instead of hate, chose to believe that change was possible even when everything said it was not. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they rose to leave. These 5 who had once been enemies and were now something that transcended such simple labels. They were witnesses to what people could become when necessity forced them past their own limitations. They were proof that even in the darkest moments, there was always a choice. And they had chosen hope. The canyon stood silent after they left, the cairn of stones marking the place where death had been intended and life had been chosen. The wind sang through the rocks, carrying their story forward into a future they would not live to see, but had helped to create. 5 people from 5 tribes, unlikely friends, improbable heroes, impossible survivors. The canyon remembered, the stones remembered. And in the lodges and camps scattered across the territories, people remembered too, telling the story to their children and their children's children, the story of the Canyon of 5 Fires, where the old world ended and something new began. The frontier would never be the same, neither would they. And that, in the end, was enough.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.